It was 20 below. The morning 16-year-old Leah Arden vanished. The snow had turned the highway into a sheet of glass, and the buses were running late. Her mother Claire remembered watching the girl walk down the drive, wool scarf bright against the gray wind, the school backpack bumping against her shoulder. She didn't know that would be the last shape she'd see moving through the storm. For 11 days, search teams combed the frozen marshes east of Pine Ridge, tracing tracks that disappeared under drifts and reappeared near the abandoned mine. Radios crackled, dogs barked, and every evening the same question echoed through the church hall. How could someone vanish so close to home? What the searchers didn't know, what the family would only learn years later, was that Leah's disappearance uncovered something older, buried beneath the snow long before she was born. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from today. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. At 7 a.m., the Arden house smelled of toast and engine exhaust. Frost had crept up the kitchen window overnight, sealing the view into a pale blur of white. 16-year-old Leah Arden was tying the laces of her winter boots, half listening to the radio chatter about a light flurry warning. Her mother Claire poured coffee and muttered that the forecast was never right. Her father Michael brushed snow off the truck windshield outside, his breath rising like steam. It was January 12th. 2006, the kind of cold that made doors stick and time slow down. Leah zipped her parka, slung her backpack, and looped the wool scarf once around her neck. It was the one her mother knitted every winter break. Same red yarn, same uneven edge where Claire's hands always faltered. The scarf was her mother's ritual, a private superstition against the endless Manitoba winter. "Bus stops slick," Michael called from the porch. "Take the road edge, not the ditch." Leah nodded, half smiling, her hair static from the dry air. She stepped into the snow, leaving shallow prints that the wind immediately softened. By 7:25, the sun had begun to rise, a dim copper disk behind a veil of blowing snow. The school bus was late as usual when the temperature dropped below -20. Leah checked her watch, kicked at the frost rim around the signpost, and looked up the road. Nothing but white noise. She waited another 10 minutes, then started walking north. The road curved toward the tree line where power poles tilted like matchsticks. Her tracks followed them neat and parallel until the snow began to thicken. At 8 a.m., Claire called the school. The secretary said the buses hadn't arrived yet, that they'd phone when they did. By noon, the storm had turned heavy enough to cancel all routes. Teachers phoned parents to confirm attendance. Leah wasn't among those who arrived. At 4 p.m., Michael returned home with his jacket crusted in ice. They said she never showed. His voice cracked. Claire's coffee spilled on the table, spreading like an ink blot. The police were called. Within 2 hours, the local RCMP detachment organized a standard missing person protocol: radius search, canine deployment, volunteer canvass. The roads were nearly impassable, snowmobiles fueled and loaded. Claire sat in the kitchen with a paper map circling where she thought Leah might have walked. She drew an X at the turnoff by the old pump station. That night, volunteers gathered at the church hall, the only building in town with power. Folding tables, thermoses, stacks of donated mittens. Someone printed Leah's school photo. A soft smile, freckles barely visible under poor lighting. Claire stared at it until the face blurred into shadow. Michael joined the search at first light. Snow was waist-deep along the ditches. A tracker named Eli Mestin, an older man from the nearby Cree settlement, led the line. They fanned out in grids marking each 100 meters with orange tape. By noon, they found the first sign. About 2 kilometers from the bus stop, Leah's footprints veered off the plowed road and into the open field, heading toward the timberline. The pattern showed hesitation, a stagger, then a steady rhythm. Could be she saw something, Eli said quietly, or tried to cut distance. Michael crouched, brushing away loose snow. The prints vanished near a barbed wire fence. There, tangled in the lower strand, hung the wool scarf, half frozen, the red dulling into brown frost. Forensic technicians photographed it under weak daylight. Fibers were intact, no tears, just a straight unravel at one end. The wind pressed snow against the fence, already bearing the fabric's edge. When the evidence bag sealed Claire's knees gave out. The sound of the zipper closing echoed through her chest like a verdict. That night, Claire sat in Leah's room, staring at the sketches taped to the wall. Fox's snow hares and a single unfinished drawing of the school bus from last fall. She touched the empty space where the scarf usually hung. The room smelled faintly of pencil shavings and detergent. Michael returned past midnight hands trembling from cold and exhaustion. He said they'd extend the search at dawn toward the marshland. The radio predicted worsening conditions. Claire placed her hand on his arm. "She's still out there," she whispered, not as a question. Outside, the wind scraped the siding like fingernails. A searchlight passed across the snowfield, sweeping the road where her footprints once were. At 2 a.m., Eli stayed behind, studying the map in silence. He circled a patch of forest where the snow drifted differently, older, compacted, uneven. "Storm's covering Truth fast," he murmured. "Tomorrow, it'll look like she never walked here at all." The next morning, the fence was gone beneath the storm. The scarf, once bright, now buried to its threads, its red barely visible through the ice. By then, the town had learned what cold could keep hidden. By nightfall, the scarf was half buried under fresh snow. By dawn of the second day, the search expanded beyond town limits. The temperature had fallen to -25, and the wind carried fine powder that filled every track within minutes. The search command post moved from the church hall to the volunteer fire station, where maps lined the walls and hot coffee steamed from metal urns. Michael Arden, pale from sleeplessness, stood beside the duty sergeant, marking a fresh grid. They had already covered 8 square kilometers. No new prints, no fibers, no discarded clothing. The storm erased everything faster than they could record it. At 9 a.m., snowmobiles were loaded and local volunteers paired with RCMP teams. Among them was Eli Meston, the Cree tracker who had found the scarf. He moved slower than the others, muttering that too many boots spoiled the trail. Still, they needed every set of eyes. Claire remained behind, sorting food donations and answering reporters who had begun calling from Winnipeg. She spent the afternoon labeling containers with masking tape, her handwriting stiff and uneven soup tea bandages. Between tasks, she stared at the wall map where someone had pinned Leah's photo beside the word Day 2. By evening, 70 people were in the field. The search perimeter extended east into the marshlands, a frozen expanse of reeds and shallow basins long rumored to hide old logging trails. The same wilderness where decades ago another teenager had gone missing. No one spoke of that case openly, but the older volunteers remembered. At 5 p.m., the command radio crackled through static, a faint signal from Team 3 out near the reservoir. They'd found a patch of flattened snow, maybe a rest spot. When Michael arrived, the daylight was fading. Snowmobiles idled under the pink sky exhaust, drifting like fog. Eli was kneeling by the drift, brushing away ice. "She stopped here," he said. "Knelt, maybe." The snows pressed down with a person's weight. He pointed to a small indentation nearby, oval-shaped. "That's from a thermos or cup. Someone took a break." Michael crouched beside him, heart hammering. "Any sign which way she went?" Eli shook his head. "Nothing clear. But see there?" He traced with a gloved finger a faint diagonal line disappearing toward the trees. "That's the edge of a trail. Old, wasn't made for vehicles." RCMP marked the coordinates, 49°45 and 97°8. "You labeled unsearched corridor." Claire, hearing the news, stood silently as the sergeant logged it on the whiteboard. The word corridor caught her attention, a narrow path through trees leading where no one went anymore. She remembered stories from her grandfather about a logging road near the old creek mine abandoned after a collapse. The same area the search now approached. At 7 p.m., the snow intensified again. The volunteers regrouped at the hall, faces raw from windburn. A few had minor frostbite, others clutched paper cups, too numb to drink. Michael refused to sit. He hovered near the map table, studying topography lines. "If she followed that old trail, it runs east to the mine right." "Runs," Eli replied, "but not safe. Ice under snow, old shafts open like mouths." That night, Claire stood outside the church steps, eyes fixed on the snowplows clearing Main Street. The town lights haloed in mist, each one a beacon swallowed by storm. A local pastor placed a gloved hand on her shoulder. "You'll find her," he said softly. The woods take what they will, but sometimes they give back. She wanted to believe him. Instead, she went home and opened Leah's sketchbook again. On the last page, faint pencil marks outlined a circle, maybe the sun, maybe a compass face. She hadn't noticed it before. Beneath it, a faint note in her daughter's neat script. Find true north. The next morning, RCMP issued a formal missing person bulletin dated January 14th. Attached was a photocopy of the map from the fire hall. The unsearched corridor near the mine was circled in red. The first snowmobile team to head that way reported strange interference on their radios, bursts of static like distant voices. One operator claimed his compass spun for several seconds before stabilizing. The reading showed north, pointing east. Probably magnetic drift, another said, though none of them fully believed it. Claire, meanwhile, took over coordination duties. She logged volunteer names, arranged food runs, kept morale alive with forced optimism. Every night, she called her sister in Winnipeg, her voice flat. No, nothing new. On the third night, as wind howled across the roofs, Michael found her asleep at the table, the map still beneath her hands. He folded it carefully, placed it under the lamp, and whispered, "We'll find her, Claire." But even he didn't sound sure anymore. At dawn, Eli approached the couple with a small object wrapped in cloth. Was near that old corridor, he said quietly. Could be hers. Inside was a small silver compass, its lid dented initials LA, faintly scratched on the back. Claire covered her mouth. Michael's eyes burned with disbelief. Her grandfather's, he said. He gave it to her before he passed. Eli nodded, setting it on the table. Still works. Needles steady. He paused, then added, but when I opened it out there, it spun like mad. The sergeant logged the find at 11:45 a.m. The compass was tagged, photographed, and sealed. The storm outside raged on, burying the old tracks once more. The search would continue for 9 more days, and none of them yet knew the corridor led not only to the forest, but to something older, half hidden in ice and silence. A searcher's radio crackled. They'd found something metal in the snow. The metallic glint came from beneath a wind-scoured ridge barely visible through the swirling snow. When the searchers brushed away the ice, they saw it, a silver compass, half buried, its lid sprung open. The hinge was bent, the glass fogged by condensation. Sergeant Rogers took photographs, his gloved fingers shaking in the cold. "Tag it," he ordered quietly. Could be hers. By 2 p.m., word had reached the fire station. Claire stood frozen when the radio confirmed it. Object recovered, potential personal item. The team described its position 2 kilometers from where Leah's scarf had been found. The compass matched the family's description. Claire had watched Leah slip it into her coat pocket every winter since her grandfather's death. She whispered his name now as if it were a prayer. Michael joined the field crew before sunset. The snow was waist-deep, trees coated with white crusts that glimmered under their headlamps. He knelt by the shallow burrow where the compass had been found, a hollow carved into a drift just big enough for a person to crawl inside. The snow around it was uneven, as if something had shifted inside recently. When they probed with poles, they struck a layer of ice no more than 10 inches below the surface. The dogs sniffed, circled, then whined. Inside the burrow, Eli found a fragment of blue denim, torn clean along the seam. Could be pant leg, he murmured. Could be nothing. But the fabric was stiff with frost, and the stitching matched Leah's jeans from her school photo. They sealed it in a bag. Rogers examined the compass under his flashlight. It's iced through, he said, but no blood, no rust. It's been out here days, not weeks. When he closed the lid, the needle twitched erratically before settling north again. That's strange, he muttered, slipping it into an evidence pouch. The light faded early, and the search team retreated to the snowmobiles. Over the radio, one of the drivers said he saw a flicker of light deep among the trees. Not a flashlight. Something dimmer like a candle moving between trunks. Rogers wrote it off as a reflection, but Eli watched the direction long after the engine started. Wind doesn't carry light, he said under his breath. At headquarters, Claire clutched the compass when Rogers handed it over for identification. Her hands shook. It's hers, she said. That scratch on the back, I told her not to carve it. The sergeant nodded. We'll keep it sealed. We'll get it dusted at the lab. That night, the news reached Winnipeg. Reporters called headlines spread teen missing in Manitoba blizzard, personal belongings found. The photograph of the compass appeared online, magnified until the initials blurred. Michael refused to leave the station. He studied the topographic maps again, following the grid coordinates from the scarf to the compass. The line between them traced a diagonal toward the old Creek Mine Road, long closed after a collapse in the 1980s. That's the same place, he said to Rogers, where those boys went missing years ago. The officer frowned. You mean the Norcross case? Michael nodded. Yeah, same month, same storm season. Rogers hesitated before replying. That case was never confirmed. 2 boys skipped town. That's what the file says. Then, why was their truck found near the mine entrance? Michael asked. The officer's jaw tightened. Because that's what happens in winter. People go looking for shelter. Doesn't mean ghosts took them. But later that night, alone in his truck, Rogers opened his laptop and pulled up the 1983 Norcross file. Missing persons. 2 17-year-olds. Last seen near Pine Ridge during a snowstorm. Evidence log listed 1 recovered item, a broken compass. He shut the file quietly. Meanwhile, the Arden family house had turned into a vigil. Neighbors brought casseroles, candles, and unhelpful reassurance. Claire barely spoke. Her sister from Winnipeg arrived, taking over meals and phone calls. Every surface in the living room was covered with flyers, maps, and coffee rings. At 10 p.m., Michael returned home, his face raw from wind and disbelief. They think she took the wrong turn, he said. Followed the drainage ditch instead of the main road. The compass might have jammed. Claire looked up. She knew that road better than anyone. Storm does strange things to direction. So do secrets, she whispered, though she didn't know why she said it. That night, she dreamed of Leah walking through a field of ice, holding the compass steady in both hands. When she woke, the radio was murmuring an update. Search to expand to mine corridor tomorrow. She lay still, listening to the hum of the heater, the ticking of pipes. For a moment, she thought she heard tapping, faint but deliberate, from somewhere inside the walls. By morning, the search party reassembled. They followed the trail northeast, where wind-carved ridges rose like frozen waves. The marsh gave way to pine thickets. Rogers led the group past a frozen creek and into the shadowed basin beyond. At 11:45 a.m., Eli's voice came through the radio. Found a structure. The team reached him 20 minutes later. It wasn't a cabin, more like a ruin, a collapsed timber shelter buried under years of snow. A rusted stovepipe jutted from one side, icicles hanging from its rim. Inside, they found scattered debris, an old tin mug, fragments of paper, and in the corner what looked like the outline of a sleeping bag, frozen stiff. They photographed everything. The paper fragments, once thawed, showed partial writing pencil marks smudged by moisture. Rogers could only make out 2 words, north and home. Michael stood in the doorway, staring at the half-buried stove. Something about its shape felt familiar, an image from his father's old hunting trips. He stepped forward, brushing frost from the metal. Underneath, faintly engraved, were initials J.A. His breath caught. Jonas Arden, his brother. The same brother who had vanished 10 years earlier in this very forest. The compass in Roger's pocket clicked softly, the needle quivering like something alive. The needle spun wild when the officer closed the lid. By the 4th day, the weather eased enough for sunlight to break through the haze. The landscape glared white in glassy snow crust, hardened by wind trees sheathed in ice. The town thawed slightly, but no one felt warmth. The search had moved beyond hope into endurance. Claire Arden sat alone in the church basement, where volunteers sorted donated mittens and fuel vouchers. Her fingers traced the folded newspaper showing Leah's school photo. Above it, bold letters, Day 4. No leads. She had stopped counting cups of coffee, stopped answering the phone. The clock on the wall ticked like a metronome, marking absence. Around noon, Sergeant Rogers entered, his face red from cold. We're pushing the line past the creek. Found some old structures up there. Miners' bunkhouses, maybe. Jonas used to work there, Claire said quietly. He paused, surprised. Your brother. He left in '96. They said he went north for logging, but he never came back. Rogers jotted something in his notebook, then closed it without comment. That afternoon, the RCMP expanded the search perimeter to the edge of the mine property, officially sealed after the 1980 collapse, though everyone in town knew people still hunted there for scrap metal. Snowmobiles idled near the tree line as officers combed the cabins. Inside one, they found the remnants of a small fire, charred wood, a tin pot fused by heat, and the faint smell of smoke still clinging to the rafters. A searcher found a map pinned to the wall, yellowed and warped by moisture. The edges were torn. Pencil markings traced a crooked route from Pine Ridge to an area labeled East Ridge Trail. Someone had drawn faint X's near the abandoned shafts. When Rogers photographed it, he noticed the handwriting didn't match Leah's school notes from home. The letters were sharp, cramped, older. Forensic technicians logged the map at 2:15 p.m. When they removed it from the wall, a second sheet slipped loose behind it, a fragment of newspaper from 1983 reporting teens lost near Creek Mine. Rogers stared at it for a long moment, then folded it into the evidence envelope. Meanwhile, back in town, Claire went to the archives building beside the post office, a narrow room that smelled of dust and heating oil. She asked the clerk for storm records from previous decades. Together, they spread boxes across a table, yellow folders marked 1979-1990. She scanned lists of missing persons, and her hand stopped on one name, Jonas Arden, last seen December 1996, presumed dead exposure. The case file was one page. No search photos, no follow-up, just a typed note. Recovered scarf read return to family. Claire frowned. Her brother had never owned a red scarf. She'd knitted those only for Leah. She opened the drawer, marked Photo Index. Inside were laminated aerial photos from various years' mining operations, winter festivals, RCMP documentation. On the back of one from 1983, she noticed a faint outline, a young man in a parka standing by a snowmobile, a scarf looped around his neck. The image was blurry, but the pattern of yarn looked the same misaligned stripe near the fringe. Her stomach tightened. "That can't be," she whispered. The clerk leaned over. "Looks like the same scarf, doesn't it?" "It's impossible," Claire said, but her voice trembled. She copied the photograph and tucked it into her coat pocket. That evening, the sun set early. The RCMP convoy returned with more debris from the bunkhouse metal tools, a tin cup and a partial map fragment, still damp from melted frost. Rogers laid them out on the table under the harsh fluorescent light. "Who drew this?" Michael asked. Rogers shook his head. "Could be Jonas. Could be anyone who worked the site." He pointed to the penciled route. "But look here, it bypasses the main road entirely. Runs through the marsh straight into the ridge. That's the same corridor where your daughter's prints led." Michael's jaw clenched. "So she followed an old trail that doesn't exist anymore." "Or Eli said from the corner someone showed her where it was." The room went silent. Rogers rubbed his temples. "We'll check the mine entrances tomorrow. No one goes alone." At home that night, Claire laid the photograph of Jonas on the table beside Leah's school portrait. The resemblance startled her, the same jawline, same calm eyes. She remembered how Jonas used to say, "The forest remembers what we forget." She didn't sleep. She sat by the window until first light, watching the snow swirl under the street lamp. The next day, volunteers reported seeing colored fabric high in the trees about 3 miles east of the trail. When the team reached it, they found a strip of red wool snagged around a high branch, flapping faintly in the wind. The height made no sense far above reach even with poles. Rogers examined it through binoculars. The yarn looked identical to the scarf Claire had knitted. He lowered the glasses slowly. How would it get up there? "Wind can carry things strange," one volunteer offered. Eli shook his head. "Not that high, not by chance." When the branch finally broke under the searcher's weight, the scarf fell into the snow like a slow ember. Its ends were clean, no tears, as though someone had tied it carefully and left it to be found. Claire stared at the recovered fabric hours later, running her fingers over the pattern. "This isn't the same one they found at the fence," she said. Rogers looked at the evidence tags. "Different thread count." "You're right," she exhaled shakily. "Then how many scarves are there?" The sergeant didn't answer. He simply marked the new coordinates on the board. That night, as Claire walked home, she passed the frozen river and saw a faint light flickering between the pines, a dull orange gone as soon as she looked twice. Wind howled down the valley, carrying a whisper that sounded almost like her brother's name. She tightened her coat and walked faster, not daring to look back. Something had hung that scarf too high for wind alone. By the fifth morning, the temperature climbed above freezing, turning the drifts into heavy slush. The snow no longer fell, it melted, and with it came the slow unveiling of what the blizzard had buried. Searchers trudged through ankle-deep water, their radios crackling under sleet. The landscape looked bruised, scarred by the passage of machines and footprints. Claire stayed in the fire station, hunched over the map. Each recovered item, scarf, compass, fabric scrap, was pinned with red string like a constellation whose meaning no one could read. Michael returned from the field around noon, soaked to the waist. "We found a fire pit," he said, voice strained. "Fresh within a week." The command team gathered around as Rogers unfolded the photographs. A circle of melted snow revealed charred wood, the remains of a small fire ringed by stones. Nearby, a tin cup, a burned scrap of fabric, and two distinct sets of boot prints, one small, narrow, consistent with Leah's shoe size, and one larger, older tread, worn smooth. Eli studied the photos. "That's not animal," he murmured. "Someone was there with her." Rogers marked the site as Point Echo. Forensic technicians bagged ash samples for analysis, tagging them with GPS coordinates. By afternoon, the lab radioed back from the district office. The charcoal composition matched wood from the old mine. Timbers, spruce resin heavy, no longer common in nearby forests. Someone had scavenged beams from the collapsed mine to burn for heat. Michael stared at the report. So whoever was with her knew exactly where to find that wood. Rogers didn't reply. He was looking at the boot prints. One of them's her size, yes. The other worn soles patch repair on the left heel. Old work boot pattern, discontinued years ago. Claire joined them at the table. Jonas wore those, she said softly. He never bought new ones after the last thaw. The room went still. Outside, the slush froze again as dusk came early. Searchers lit flares along the trail to mark progress. They followed the tracks east until the trees thinned and a wide clearing opened, framed by skeletal poplars. There, at the clearing's edge, they found a broken crate, a torn top, and an object half buried in ice, a metal lunch tin containing a folded photograph of two young men standing beside a snowmobile. One of them was unmistakably Jonas, the other unknown. The back of the photo carried a note in pencil, East Ridge Mine, 1983. Rogers squinted. "This can't be your brother's." Michael turned pale. "That's his face. And that jacket, he wore that every winter." Eli tilted his head. 83 was the Norcross year. Rogers ordered the photo sealed. He didn't mention the chill running down his spine when he noticed something else. The corner of the picture had a faint smudge, a fingerprint pressed into the paper. The forensic team scanned it later that night. The print didn't match Leah nor either parent. It was partial but distinct male, middle-aged. Claire spent that night at the church hall again, unable to face the empty house. A volunteer played the local radio, softly weather reports, farm advisories, the quiet hum of life continuing elsewhere. She stared at the scarf folded in an evidence bag on the table, remembering how Leah used to complain about it, itching her neck. She ran her hand over the plastic and whispered, "You hold on, baby." At 9 p.m., Rogers called from the field. "We found something else. Campfires about 50 meters from an old path down to the river. There's a small shed down there. Doors half collapsed." Michael's truck was already idling before the officer finished. Claire climbed in beside him. The snow squeaked under the tires as they drove through the woods. When they arrived, the scene was lit by headlamps and the faint glow of the aurora above. The shed was no more than a lean-to built from old mine planks, roof sagging under ice. Inside, soot blackened the walls. In the corner, a blanket lay folded over a wooden crate. Michael lifted it with shaking hand. Beneath was a metal tag stamped Creek Mine Property, Arden Unit, 1982. Rogers stared. That name again. Michael ran his fingers over the letters, snow melting down his wrist. "He built this," he whispered. "He worked here." Claire looked around. A faint smell lingered, smoke and something sweet, almost like canned peaches. She noticed a tin of condensed milk on the shelf, its lid pried open days ago. Someone had been here alive. The forensic photographer snapped images of everything, including a small indentation on the floorboards where something had sat round metallic about the size of the compass. But the object itself was missing. When they reviewed the photos later, Rogers frowned. Compass was logged in evidence. No one should have had it out here. "Unless there were two," Claire said. Rogers turned to her. "What do you mean?" "My father had one just like it. He gave one to each of them, Jonas and Leah. Same engraving, same make." Silence. Then Eli murmured, "Brothers, compass, niece's compass. North finds blood." The fire station lights burned through the night as the data came in. Charcoal analysis, timber age, boot impressions all confirmed proximity to the mine's outer perimeter. By 3 a.m., Rogers stared at the evidence photo of the compass from 3 days ago. The glass now appeared cracked along one edge. It hadn't been cracked when they found it. The chain of custody showed no mishandling. He logged a note, evidence possibly disturbed. Investigate transfer anomaly. Then shut his notebook, exhaling hard. Claire, asleep at the table nearby, dreamed of Leah walking beside a shadowed figure. She couldn't see someone carrying a lantern through a white corridor. The light flickered, and in its brief flare she saw Jonas's face. The wind outside moaned through the vent shafts like a voice trying to rise from the snow. When morning came, the sun revealed a new pattern near the camp. A trail of melted frost leading east, faint but visible under the crust. The prints ended at the tree line. Beside them, embedded in the ice, something small and pale gleamed. A single tooth cap. Too small for a child. Too new to be hers. In the ash, they found a tooth cap. Too new to be hers. The weather turned brutal again. The melt froze overnight into glassy armor, sealing tire ruts, footprints, and evidence under a new crust. The cold came back harder, the kind that burned the lungs and silenced birds. The search halted for 3 days. Inside the church hall, cots lined the walls. Volunteers slept in layers of jackets. The air smelled of propane heaters and wet wool. Claire and Michael stayed in a corner beside a corkboard of maps. Every pin, every red string now felt like a wound reopening. The scarf, the compass, the ash circle, the tooth cap. The search had stopped feeling like rescue, it felt like excavation. Reporters had started to leave their vans, crawling back toward Winnipeg. The national news cycle had already moved on, but the Ardens couldn't. They waited eyes hollow as the storm battered the stained glass windows. Late on the second night, Michael went to the truck for air and found a letter tucked under the windshield wiper, sealed in a sandwich bag. The envelope was old, the ink faded. Inside, folded once, lay a single sheet of yellowed paper written in his brother's hand. The first words read, "If you're reading this, I couldn't stay quiet any longer." Michael's breath fogged the glass. He read the rest under the dome light. Jonas writing about the project, about the creek's diversion, about things buried in the ridge when the mine sealed its shaft. At the end, a single line. "Tell Claire I saw something in that forest that should have stayed buried." Michael brought it inside. Claire sat up as he spread the page on the table. Her eyes widened at the handwriting, the tight slanted print she'd seen in old birthday cards. "That's his," she whispered. Rogers called from the station arrived within minutes. He read the letter twice before bagging it. "We'll need handwriting confirmation." By morning, RCMP labs confirmed the writing matched Jonas Arden's 1996 employment forms. The letter was genuine, yet the paper fibers showed little degradation, as though it hadn't been outdoors more than a few weeks. "How is that possible?" Claire asked. Rogers didn't answer. He only wrote chain of custody gap in his notes. At midday, the storm broke. Sunlight glared on the snowdrifts and steam rose from rooftops. Volunteers emerged bleary-eyed, ready to search again. The radio chatter resumed. Eli rejoined the group, silent as always, his expression carved from stone. As they prepared to ride out, a CBC van arrived to film updates. Claire stood behind the camera crews, watching the reporter describe Leah's miraculous survival chances, though none existed yet. She could barely recognize herself on the live feed, pale lips, chapped eyes that seemed older than her body. That night, she returned to the empty house to gather clothes. The silence was unbearable. In Leah's room, she opened the dresser and found another of her sketchbooks beneath folded sweaters. Inside, the drawings were darker, now dense pencil smudges of trees, tunnels, and one repeated image, a narrow corridor with light spilling from an unseen source. At the bottom of one page, written sideways, were the words, "Jonas says follow the sound." Claire dropped the book. Her pulse raced. She turned the page, another sketch, this time of a mine shaft mouth marked with a crude X. She drove back to the church hall at once. Rogers met her halfway. "Where did you get this?" he demanded, flipping through the pages. "In her drawer." "It's recent. Maybe she saw this place before." Rogers frowned. "But she's been missing 10 days. Michael stepped forward. "Then who drew the rest?" No one answered. That night, volunteers reviewed the original radio logs. At 6:42 p.m. on the second day of search, one transmission had recorded interference, a faint tapping pattern mistaken for static. Someone replayed it now at half speed. The sound became clear, 3 taps, pause, 3 taps again. Eli murmured, "That's a code. Old logging signal for distress." Rogers leaned closer. "From which direction?" "North Ridge." Same as the letter. By the next morning, the snow had hardened enough for travel. Teams set out toward the ridge again. The wind cut sharp skies, washed pale blue. The coordinates from the radio log pointed them near a line of vent shafts half collapsed and rimmed with ice. At 11:10 a.m., a searcher stopped short. "There," he said, pointing to a boot print frozen into solid ice beside one shaft, small, clean, deep. No snow had covered it since it froze. The shape was unmistakable, Leah's boot tread preserved like glass. Rogers crouched, touching the surface with his glove. She was here after the last melt. Michael stared into the black mouth of the shaft. Air drifted from it, faintly warmer, carrying an earthy scent. "If she went down there," he began but couldn't finish. They set up lights and cameras, lowering a probe. The signal showed a tunnel descending 30 feet before branching into 2 narrow passages. As the sun dipped, Rogers logged the coordinates. 9°46 and 97°36 to North Vent Shaft. Claire stood a few paces away, staring at the horizon. In the half-light, the ridgeline looked like a frozen wave, silent and immense. She thought of her brother's letter, of his warning about something that should have stayed buried. That night, as floodlights flickered on the ridge and crews worked to secure ropes, the sky cleared completely. Stars burned over the mine like frost pinned to velvet. The air was sharp enough to sting. Michael sat in the truck, the letter folded in his coat pocket, unable to shake the image of Jonas's handwriting appearing decades late. The radio crackled once faintly, then silence. In the distance, the frozen boot print gleamed under the floodlight, perfect, undisturbed. Snow melt revealed a boot print frozen into solid ice. By the 7th morning, the air was still and razor cold, the kind of silence that makes sound itself brittle. The ridge loomed ahead of the search crew's vent shafts, like black eyes in the white crust. RCMP had set up floodlights and generators, their cables snaking through the snow like veins. Rogers stood beside the tripod rig, watching the monitor flicker as the probe descended. 32 feet, the technician said. Walls narrowing, no collapse yet. A gust of wind pushed loose powder over the edge. The rope trembled. On screen, a slant of light glinted off ice-coated timber's old mining supports. Then just before the feed crackled into static, the camera caught something pale wedged in the wall, a strip of fabric, deep red. Rogers exhaled slowly. Mark that frame. By 9 a.m., the snowmobiles had returned with heavier gear. Claire and Michael stood behind the cordon tape, hands clasped so tightly their knuckles whitened. The smell of diesel and coffee mingled with the metallic tang of cold. "They found color down there," Rogers said carefully. "Could be cloth, could be nothing." Claire's voice was steady. "If it's hers, bring her home." They began widening the shaft entrance. Ice broke in chunks. Each strike echoed through the vent like a slow drum beat. Eli worked with the crew, wordless eyes flicking to the tree line. "Forest's too quiet," he muttered once, "like it's holding its breath." By midday, they broke through a narrow tunnel that sloped downward into shadow. The first two rescuers crawled in headlamps sweeping over a timber wall slick with frost. At the end of the passage, a cavity opened barely big enough for a small tent. On the ground, they found fragments: a torn mitten, the stub of a candle, and a flattened tin marked Peaches, 1983. Rogers photographed everything. He noticed soot along the rock, fresh black streaks overlaying older, grayer ones. "Someone's been burning here," he said. A low crack came from the right wall, shifting ice or something beneath it. The rescuers froze. Then from somewhere deeper in the shaft came a faint sound, 3 knocks evenly spaced. "Hold!" Rogers whispered, his throat dry. "Repeat signal." The knocks came again. Ropes uncoiled, lights lowered. The air down there was warm, 10 degrees higher than the surface. Carbon monoxide monitors beeped low but safe. When they reached the source of the sound, they saw a wooden panel blocking a secondary cavity. Rogers pressed his glove against it and felt a pulse of air, rhythmic, shallow. "Get that open." It took 15 minutes. When the panel gave way, a small pocket revealed itself, an air chamber formed by fallen timbers. Inside, half buried in blankets, lay a girl, Leah. Her face was pale skin. Waxy lips cracked, her eyes fluttered at the light. One rescuer shouted her name. She stirred, whispering something hoarse, almost inaudible. They wrapped her in thermal foil, checked her pulse, faint but steady. "Pulse 30, the medic said. "Core temps dropping." They hoisted her up carefully, passing her along the rope line like a fragile relic. Above ground, Claire collapsed when she saw the stretcher rise. Michael ran forward but was held back as paramedics worked. The girl's lashes were crusted with ice. Her right hand clutched something, a small metal disc, dull silver. Rogers leaned close. The compass, but when he reached for it, she tightened her grip as though guarding it. "Ma'am, we have to go." The medic barked. The helicopter was already inbound from Winnipeg. As they loaded her onto the sled, Claire knelt beside her daughter. Leah's eyelids trembled open for a second. She whispered a word that sounded like uncle. Then she was gone into the rotor-wash. Rogers watched the aircraft lift off its downwash, scattering snow across the ridge. He turned to Eli. "You heard that?" The tracker nodded. She said Jonas. Later at base camp, the data log recorded every timestamp: 1:46 p.m. Subject extracted. 1:58 p.m. vital signs stabilizing. 2:20 p.m. airlift departed. Rogers stared at the entry line for a long time. "We'll need to search deeper," he finally said. "If she was down there, someone helped her last longer than she should have." Eli frowned. "You mean fed her?" "Fed her, covered her, maybe sheltered her from the cold." They reviewed the shaft video again. In one frame before contact, something moved behind a timber, a blur too dark to be shadow. Rogers replayed it 5 times before killing the feed. That night, Claire sat in the hospital waiting room, Leah still in surgery. The attending nurse came out briefly to report that her body temperature had been 27 degrees Celsius upon arrival, near death, yet somehow reversible. They called it a miracle. When they removed her belongings for drying, the nurse handed Claire a sealed evidence bag. Inside lay the same compass, its lid dented but intact. But now a folded scrap of paper was wedged beneath its chain. On it, written faintly in graphite, were 2 words: "Not yet." Claire turned the note over and over. The handwriting was identical to Jonas's. At the ridge, as night fell, wind stirred the loose snow into ghostly spirals. The search team left floodlights burning for safety. Down in the shaft, unseen in the dark, the melted candles guttered out one by one. Then came 3 soft knocks from somewhere deeper underground. Not echo, not wind. Rogers looked up sharply. "Who's still down there?" No one answered. A distant echo carried through the shaft, 3 soft knocks. When the helicopter touched down in Winnipeg, the blades scattered grit across the hospital roof. Medics rushed Leah Arden through the emergency entrance, her body wrapped in foil, her skin an unnatural shade between blue and gray. Inside, fluorescent lights reflected off snowmelt puddles as doctors shouted orders, heated IV oxygen cardiac monitor, rewarming blankets. The numbers on the monitor hovered low but steady. Claire followed on the next flight, her coat still stiff with frost. She didn't remember the drive from the airfield, only the sterile hallways and the smell of saline and cold metal. When she saw Leah, tubes running from both arms, she thought she'd stumbled into someone else's life. The girl's hair was matted, her face thin, her lips moving faintly, though no sound came. At 6:05 p.m., the attending physician spoke quietly. She's hypothermic but viable. 27 degrees Celsius core on arrival. We've seen lower survive. The human body can be stubborn. Michael pressed his forehead against the glass. She made it 11 days, he murmured. 11 days out there. She wasn't alone, Claire said. Her tone wasn't speculation, it was certainty. Forensics at the hospital confirmed several anomalies. Fragments of ash embedded in Leah's parka matched the wood from the mine's old bunkhouses. Soot stains lined her sleeves, suggesting she'd been near fire, not simply trapped underground. When asked how she survived, Leah said only one thing before falling asleep. He helped me. Who, the nurse asked. Her eyelids fluttered. Jonas. Doctors assumed hallucination from exposure. But when Claire heard it, she sank to the floor. That night, Rogers arrived with updates. We checked the shaft. There's no sign of another person down there, no footprints, no extra gear. Just her things and a few old timbers. He looked at the compass sealed in an evidence bag on the tray beside the bed. We found this with her again. Thought you should know. Claire stared at it. The lid was closed, but condensation fogged the glass. It's not supposed to be here, she whispered. You logged it at the station. Rogers frowned. It was logged. Then it wasn't. He didn't tell her the rest, that the evidence locker had been inspected twice, and in both cases one envelope marked Item 7A. Compass was missing. The replacement envelope returned anonymously was empty except for the note that read, Not yet. At dawn, Leah woke. Her voice was rasping words slow, like someone learning to speak again. Was it real, she asked. Claire took her hand. What, sweetheart? The place, the light. He told me not to move. Said they'd come. Claire hesitated. Who said that? Leah blinked. Jonas. She paused, searching her mother's face. He had frost in his hair. He said the storm wasn't done. The nurse adjusted the IV, eyes downcast. Rogers made notes silently at the foot of the bed. 2 days later, Leah was stable enough for transfer. News crews filled the lobby, calling her the miracle girl of Pine Ridge. Flashbulbs followed her stretcher as Michael guided it toward the ambulance. Claire shielded her from the cameras. No questions, she snapped. In the back of the vehicle, Leah shivered despite the heat. Around her neck, tucked under the blanket, was the same wool scarf, but tied in a knot. Neither parent recognized double-loop the ends tucked inward. Claire noticed immediately. Who tied that? Leah frowned weakly. He did. Said it keeps the wind from whispering. Claire's hand froze midair. Leah nodded once before sleep took her. Back at the mine site, crews packed up the last of the equipment. The shaft was resealed, officially classified unsafe for entry. Rogers signed the closure order himself, though he lingered by the rim for several minutes afterward, staring down into the dark. He swore he could still feel a faint vibration through the frozen ground, like something breathing far below. Later that evening, he stopped by the fire station to file reports. On the bulletin board hung a grid of photos, the scarf, the campfire, the mine shaft, and Leah's compass, each pinned with tags. But one image stood out, the close-up of the compass needle taken on the day of recovery. The needle, blurred by motion, pointed not north but slightly east. In the next photo, taken hours later, it pointed due west. Rogers pulled the prints down, tucking them into his folder. Magnetic interference, he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. In the hospital, the night nurse heard tapping from Leah's room around 3 a.m. She entered quietly. The girl was asleep, but her hand moved under the blanket, fingers twitching in rhythm. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps again. Leah, the nurse whispered. No response. The monitor beeped steadily. On the nightstand beside the bed lay the compass lid closed. The nurse hadn't placed it there. When she leaned closer, she noticed moisture condensing inside the glass, as though from breath. She backed away, slowly turning off the light. By morning, Leah's temperature had normalized. Reporters flooded the corridor, calling it a miracle of endurance. Claire ignored them. She sat by the bed, brushing strands of hair from her daughter's forehead, whispering stories from when Leah was little, how she used to run across the yard chasing snowflakes. At 10 a.m., Leah woke fully for the first time. "Mom," she said quietly. "I heard him. He was under the floor." Claire froze. "Who?" Leah's gaze was distant. "He said the mine was built on someone else's bones. That's why it breathes." The nurse's clipboard slipped from her hand. Rogers, standing in the doorway, felt something cold tighten behind his ribs. "Leah?" he asked carefully. "What else did he say?" She looked at him, eyes glassy but focused. "He said he was sorry." The room fell silent except for the monitor's soft beeping. Outside, the city thawed under weak sun, icicles dropping from ledges one by one. But above the hospital roof, the wind still carried faint snow swirling east toward Pine Ridge. Her first word was Jonas. Leah Arden became a national headline before she could stand on her own feet. Found after 11 days blared across every paper from Winnipeg to Toronto. Photos of the ridge, the scarf, and the rescue flooded the internet, each one a piece of a story the public wanted to believe a girl against the elements a miracle of survival. None mentioned the letter, the second scarf, or the word she had whispered on the stretcher. Reporters crowded the hospital entrance. Claire shut her daughter's door to keep them out. She wanted silence, the kind only the frozen woods had known. By day 6 of recovery, Leah could speak in full sentences. Her voice was thin, dry, like air escaping from a pipe. When a social worker asked how she survived, she answered simply, "A man was there." "What kind of man?" "He had gray in his hair. He talked quiet. He said he'd get me home." The social worker smiled gently. "Was this a rescuer?" "Someone from the search." Leah hesitated. "He said his name was Jonas." Claire froze in the corner. Her heartbeat thudded so loud she thought the others could hear it. "Sweetheart Uncle Jonas has been gone a long time." "I know," Leah said, but he wasn't gone there. Forensics continued to process the mine site. Soil samples, fabric fibers, and burn residue all logged. Then came the lab call. The tooth cap from the ash pit carried familial DNA matching the Arden line. The analysis was partial but conclusive enough. Rogers called Claire and Michael into his office. He closed the door gently before speaking. "We ran the DNA. It's family. Male relative. Could be Jonas." Michael leaned back, staring through the wall. "So he was there?" Rogers nodded. "Maybe not recently, but his remains or something from him were burned in that fire." Claire whispered. "Then how could she have seen him?" Rogers rubbed his eyes. "I don't know. Maybe she saw someone who looked like him. Maybe her mind filled the gap. Trauma does that." He didn't mention that he'd replayed the shaft video dozens of times, slowing each frame until he nearly convinced himself he'd seen a shadow behind the timbers move. Meanwhile, Leah began drawing again. The therapist encouraged her to use sketches to recall what happened. On the second day, she handed her mother a drawing, a small cabin, 2 figures sitting by a fire, and a single lantern on the table. One of the figures was distinctly male, wearing a heavy coat. The other, smaller, held a scarf wrapped high around the neck. "He gave me food," Leah said. "Peaches from a can. He said not to go outside because the forest gets loud when it's hungry." Claire's voice shook. "Did he tell you where he came from?" "He said he'd been there before me," Leah whispered. "Said he'd been waiting for the storm to end." At night, Leah's temperature ran high, and she murmured in her sleep phrases caught between dream and confession. "He said they covered it, under the dam, the ones they never told about." The nurse noted the words in her chart. Rogers read them the next morning and underlined "under the dam." It was the first time that phrase appeared in any of the old mine records. He drove back to Pine Ridge the next day, unable to let it go. Snow had hardened again, and the mine sat silent under the pale sky. Inside the sealed shaft, condensation dripped from the timbers like sweat. He stood where the rescuers had first broken through flashlight beam, cutting through steam. On the wall, faint pencil marks scratched into the wood read, "North Home, 1983. He snapped photos and sent them to forensics. The handwriting wasn't Leah's, it was Jonas's. That night, while logging the images, Rogers received an encrypted email from the regional RCMP archive. The file contained scanned records from 1996 Jonas Arden, missing presumed dead. Attached were dental charts. The match was absolute. The remains found in the shaft, one fragment of molar, carbon burned but intact, belonged to Jonas Arden, dead for at least 10 years. Rogers closed his laptop, slowly staring at the ceiling. Then who the hell was with her? 2 days later, Leah was discharged into home care. Cameras waited outside. Claire shielded her from the flashes. The family returned to Pine Ridge to avoid attention. The snow along the highway had turned crusted gray, the fields flat and endless. Back at the house, the living room was unchanged. Flyers still littered the table. The scent of coffee and ash still hung in the curtains. Leah went straight to her room and sat at the window. "It's different now," she said softly. "The forest feels quiet again." Claire looked around. "You're home, that's all that matters." Leah reached into her pocket and pulled out the compass. "He said to give this back when I got home." Claire's chest tightened. "Honey, that's evidence. You shouldn't." Leah shook her head. "He gave it to me right before he left." "When was that?" "The night before you found me." Claire's voice cracked. "What did he say?" Leah stared at the spinning needle, its glass cracked. "He said it's not north that saves you. It's remembering where you started." At the station that evening, Rogers added a new entry to the case file. Subject recovered, survival unexplainable. Familial DNA confirms deceased relative present at site. He read it twice, then added a single line beneath the family notified. No further action. He looked out the window toward the ridge. The wind had started again, carrying faint flurries eastward. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang, muffled by snow. Back at the Arden house, Claire opened Leah's coat to hang it near the fire. Inside the lining, she found a scrap of fabric stitched into the hem. Square of old flannel marked in faded ink, Jonas A. Ridge Crew. She held it close, unable to tell if it was a keepsake or a warning. That night, Leah slept peacefully for the first time. In the dark, the compass on her bedside table trembled, once its needle spinning a full circle before resting at true north. And on the hospital's secure server, a final lab note appeared in the record at 11:45 p.m. Dental match confirmed. Jonas Arden, deceased since 1996. Jonas had been dead for 10 years, confirmed by dental records. Snow began to retreat from Pine Ridge in slow sheets, revealing the colorless mud beneath. By February's end, the town thawed enough for trucks to move without chains. News crews had stopped coming. The miracle story had burned out. All that remained were quiet glances at the grocery store, awkward condolences that trailed into silence. The Ardens didn't attend church anymore. They didn't answer questions. They didn't hang the newspaper clipping on their wall. Leah's recovery moved faster than anyone expected. The doctors called it resilience. Claire called it borrowed time. She noticed her daughter avoided mirrors and preferred dim rooms. When she did draw her pencils, dug grooves into the paper-black tunnels, forest ridges, doorways without doors. Michael tried to fix what he could, patching the porch, shoveling ice, keeping busy. Every few nights he'd drive out toward the mine park at the old turnoff and just sit there, engine off, listening. "The air sounds different," he told Claire once. "Like there's something under it." She didn't ask him to explain. In late March, an investigator from the provincial office arrived to audit the RCMP search logs for media records. Rogers handed over the files but kept one copy of his own photos of the shaft walls, the sketches Leah had drawn, and the final forensic chart of the tooth cap. He wasn't supposed to retain them, but something about the case wouldn't let him file it under closed. That evening, he stopped by the Ardens' home to return personal effects. Leah was at the kitchen table sketching. "Hi, officer," she said softly. Her voice still carried the rasp of frostbite scars. He smiled politely. "You're looking stronger." "I still hear the snow," she said. "Sometimes when it's quiet." Claire poured coffee for everyone, avoiding his eyes. "We're grateful," she said, meaning it yet. Her tone was defensive, weary. "But we'd like to move on." Rogers nodded. Understood. One last question. Leah, do you remember anything about where you stayed? Maybe landmarks, sound. Leah didn't look up. There was a cabin, she said. 2 beds, 1 broken, a window covered with metal. There was a cross on the door. It faced the ridge. Rogers froze. He pulled out his phone and opened a folder, photos from the mine perimeter. He found one image of a rotted timber wall with a carved cross etched from the inside. He turned the screen toward her. Like this, she nodded. Yes, only the cross was brighter. Someone burned it there. Michael spoke up quietly. When I went out last week, I found something like that. Thought it was vandalism. Rogers leaned forward. Where? North side of the ridge. Half buried. I didn't go in, didn't want to. Rogers exhaled through his nose. I'll take a look tomorrow. But by morning, the thaw had come hard. Meltwater flooded the back roads, washing away the ice crust that marked the shaft entrances. When Rogers arrived, the wooden cross cabin had partially collapsed. Only the door remained warped and half submerged. He pried it open with a crowbar. Inside, nothing but a pile of rotted boards, animal bones, and the faint smell of rust. He clicked his flashlight on. The beam caught something wedged between the planks, a strip of cloth and a metal hinge. The cloth was old flannel, marked faintly with the letters J.A. The hinge, however, was newer machined steel from a compass lid. He bagged both and called it in. That night, while reviewing his photos, Rogers noticed something subtle in the image of the door cross. Burn marks ran outward from the grooves, not inward, as if the heat had come from inside. At the same time, back at the Arden house, Claire was packing boxes. They'd decided to sell the property and move north to live by her sister's cabin near the lake. Leah stood by the window watching the trees sway under early spring wind. He's not angry, she said quietly. Claire paused mid-fold. Who isn't, Jonas? He said it wasn't his fault. Claire forced a small smile. Sweetheart, he's gone. Leah shook her head. Not all of him. The next morning, Michael returned from town with an envelope. Inside was the final forensic summary from Winnipeg. He set it on the counter but didn't open it until night. Under the lamplight, the printout read, charcoal composition consistent with mine, timbers circa 1980s. Human dental sample, identified as Jonas Arden, 99.7% match. Source of exposure, prolonged combustion in enclosed space. The last line read, estimated year of death, 1996. Michael swallowed hard. It's over, he whispered. Claire didn't answer. She stared at the fire in the wood stove. It hissed, then popped, sending sparks upward. For an instant, one spark flared brighter red like thread. The next day, Rogers came by one final time to deliver the returned evidence. He placed the compass on their mantle. You can keep this, he said quietly. Case is closed. Michael looked down at it. The glass had been replaced, the needle steady and perfectly centered. Looks brand new. Maintenance division fixed it. Rogers said, though the truth was, he hadn't requested any repair. The compass had simply appeared that way when the lab shipped it back. He hesitated at the door. You know, he said softly, we found burn residue on that cross door, heat marks from inside. Maybe someone tried to send a signal before the collapse. Claire met his gaze. And if they did, then someone answered. That night, the compass on the mantle caught the glow of the fire. Leah sat on the couch, sketching the ridge again, this time without the cross. It's gone now, she murmured. He said the wind finally stopped. Michael looked at the compass. Its needle trembled slightly, then settled. Outside, meltwater ran down the ditches, dark and clear. The forest beyond the field stood motionless, its silence deep enough to feel. Claire closed her eyes, trying to imagine spring returning, grass breaking through the thaw, but all she saw was that burned cross carved from the inside. The cross was cut from the inside of the door. Spring came late to Pine Ridge, slow and reluctant. The snow melted in streaks, leaving long bruises of mud through the fields. Rivers rose, roads buckled under thaw. The town moved on everyone except the Ardens. For them, the thaw only uncovered what winter had hidden. Claire stopped attending the post-church gatherings. Whispers followed her now. Some said Leah's survival was divine. Others muttered that the forest kept its bargains. Michael ignored them. He worked in silence, boxing the last of the house for sale. Leah wandered the yard barefoot. Despite the chill, her gaze often turned north. Rogers had transferred cases, but the Arden file sat open on his desk in Winnipeg, one yellow folder that refused to close. He still thought about the letter, the missing compass, the 3 knocks. He told himself he was chasing closure, but deep down he knew it wasn't procedure that haunted him, it was pattern. On April the 10th, a call came from the district coroner's office. "Sergeant," the voice said, "we've completed the site excavation near the ridge. You'll want to see this yourself." He drove out that same day. The ridge had changed snow, gone earth, exposed patches of dark moss spreading like bruises. The excavation site sat near the old vent shaft, where a team had begun clearing debris to stabilize the ground. What they'd uncovered wasn't part of the mine. It was older timbers cut by hand, arranged in a circle around a stone foundation. Not industrial, the coroner said, more like ceremonial. At the center of the pit, wrapped in frost-dark soil, lay human remains, partial skeleton male, early 40s. Fragments of a parka clung to the ribs. Inside one pocket, they found a rusted lighter and a broken watch stopped at 4 p.m. The coroner handed Rogers the evidence tag, Jonas Arden. Confirmed. Rogers exhaled. Then what the hell was in the fire pit? The cap could have come loose when he fell, the coroner said. But this body's been here for decades, Sergeant. He didn't die in the collapse. He died trying to seal it. Rogers looked at the timbers. Each one burned along the ends. He was building something, he murmured, or closing it. Back in town, Claire received the call she dreaded and expected all at once. She didn't cry. She walked outside, sat on the porch, and let the wind move through her hair. Leah joined her, quietly holding the compass. "They found him," Claire said. "I know," Leah replied. "He told me." Claire turned sharply. "Leah, how?" He said, "He's where the ground hums." Said, "You'll feel it when the thaw's done." Claire didn't press further. She only pulled her daughter close. A week later, the RCMP held a private reinterment for Jonas. The remains were placed in a sealed coffin under a cedar cross near the town's small cemetery. Only a handful attended the Ardens, Eli and Sergeant Rogers. The priest read a short psalm over the wind. When it ended, Leah stepped forward, scarf around her neck, and set the compass on the coffin. "This was his," she said softly. "He kept it safe." Rogers watched the needle tremble once, then settle. For a moment, he thought he heard faint tapping under the boards, like someone knocking for acknowledgement. After the burial, Eli approached him. "You feel it?" he asked quietly. "Feel what?" "The hum. Ground, still breathing. Means the place isn't done with him." Rogers frowned. "You think this was more than a collapse?" "I think it was a cover. My grandfather said the company flooded old burial pits when they built the dam. Native graves, families that never got moved. Jonas worked for them. Maybe he saw too much." That night, Rogers dug through the old archives again. In the 1980 dam project records, he found a redacted memorandum. Displacement and submersion of unregistered burial grounds. Approval granted Creek Ridge sector. The signature on the document was familiar. Thomas Arden Michael and Jonas's father. The implication hit him like a blow. The Ardens' wealth had come from that contract. The land Jonas protested wasn't abstract, it was their own. When he brought the file to Claire, she read it wordlessly. He tried to stop it. She whispered. "They said he left the company because of a fight." "I thought it was about money." "Maybe it was about guilt," Rogers said. Later that evening, he drove back to the ridge one last time. The site was quiet, except for meltwater dripping through the timbers. In the dirt near the excavation pit, something small caught the light, a metal chain. He knelt and pulled it free. At the end of the chain hung the second compass, the one that had gone missing. The glass was cracked, but inside the needle still moved slow and trembling. Rogers flipped it over. Scratched into the back was a single word, home. He placed it in an evidence bag and logged the time. 9:45 p.m. At the same hour, back at the Arden house, Claire was sorting old boxes when she found a sealed envelope tucked inside a Bible. The handwriting was Jonas's. The date November 1996, the same year he vanished. Inside was a single photograph, Jonas standing beside a younger Thomas Arden near the dam, holding surveying equipment. In the corner of the photo, barely visible, was a faint cross burned into a tree trunk. On the back, Jonas had written, "If they ask why I left, tell them to look under the ridge." Claire sat down on the floor, hands shaking. Leah entered quietly, barefoot, hair loose. "Mom," she whispered. "He's free now." Claire pulled her close, the scarf between them rough against her cheek. "I hope so," she said. Outside, the wind shifted. The forest line creaked. Somewhere beneath the thawed earth, water seeped through the old tunnels, carrying fragments of ash into the creek. Weeks later, the RCMP file closed with an addendum. Recovered remains, Jonas Arden. Cause accidental entrapment, secondary burns. No further investigation recommended. Roger signed it but added a note in pencil. Burial site predates mine foundation. Possible ceremonial structure. Refer to historical commission. He didn't send the copy. He left it in his drawer. The last evidence bag returned to the family contained the scarf and compass sealed together with final artifacts of the Ridge case. Claire placed them side by side on the mantel, unable to decide if they were relics of love or guilt. That night, she dreamed of Leah standing in the snow, the scarf glowing faintly red, the compass trembling like a heart under glass. When she woke, morning light poured across the living room. On the wall above the fireplace hung a photograph of the mine mural, an old image Claire had taken years ago. She froze when she saw it. The painted woman in the mural, long hair, calm face, looked almost exactly like Leah. In the photograph, Leah looked just like the woman in the old mine mural. Summer settled over Manitoba in a haze of pale light and long, quiet days. The river ran high from melt, carrying debris through the valley branches. Bottles, the occasional scrap of old lumber. Pine Ridge returned to its routines, fishing boats at dawn, market stalls along Main Street, the distant hum of trucks on thawed highways. Only the Arden family didn't quite return. By June, they had sold the house. Too many nights of wind knocking through the vents. Too many mornings when the compass on the mantel trembled, though no one touched it. They moved north to Claire's sister's cabin by the lake, 30 miles away, the nearest store, an hour's drive. It was quiet there, the kind of quiet that presses against the skin. The move was supposed to be an ending, but endings rarely come clean in a place that keeps its own memory. Leah adjusted well enough. She spent hours on the porch sketching the tree line, her pages filled with reflections of water and sky, never people. Sometimes she'd stand by the lake at dusk, whispering toward the woods. When Claire asked who she was talking to, she'd shrug and say, "It's just wind between trees." Michael built a small shelf for the compass and scarf. He kept them together, wrapped in glass. The compass needle would sometimes twitch when the weather changed, though the house had no drafts. Once, in late July, it spun a full circle before returning to north. He didn't tell Claire. Claire took up gardening to fill the silence. Some nights, she dreamed of Jonas, never the man she remembered, but younger eyes luminous in the dark. He'd stand by the ridge holding the same scarf, saying it wasn't supposed to be her. Rogers visited once that summer. He'd left the force, grown a beard, carried the weariness of someone who'd seen too much and said too little. He arrived unannounced, bringing a single envelope. "Found this while clearing evidence logs," he said. "Thought you should have it." Inside was a printed photo, recovered from the excavation, the two compasses side by side on a metal table, their needles both pointing slightly off north, as if toward each other. Claire traced the image with her fingertip. "You ever find peace after something like this?" she asked. Rogers smiled faintly. "Peace, no, but I stopped asking what's true." "That helps." Before he left, he walked down to the lake and skipped a stone across the surface. The ripples spread evenly, except one point near the middle where they broke a sudden hollow, as though the water dipped from underneath. He watched until the circles vanished. That evening, Leah sat by the water with the scarf wrapped loosely around her shoulders. The air smelled of pine, sap, and smoke from distant fires. "He's not gone," she said quietly. Claire joined her. "You mean Jonas?" Leah shook her head. The ridge. It's still moving. It hums when the moon's low. Claire tried to smile. You should rest, sweetheart. Leah nodded, but her eyes stayed on the dark water. He said it's quieter now that they know. Later that night, Claire walked to the mantel. The compass inside the case reflected the glow from the oil lamp. She opened the glass for the first time in months and picked it up. The metal was cold but steady. The needle pointed north, unwavering. She exhaled. Outside, the wind shifted direction. The trees leaned murmuring softly. She could almost hear words in the rustle, something like thank you. The next morning, Michael went down to the lake to check the dock. Something bright on the shore caught his eye, a flash of red against the stones. When he got closer, he saw it was a strip of fabric tangled with reeds. The color was unmistakable, deep crimson, the same shade as the wool scarf Claire had knitted years before. He lifted it gently. The yarn was still strong, only the edges frayed. How it had traveled 11 miles downstream was impossible to guess. He carried it back to the cabin and laid it on the table beside the compass. Claire came in from the porch, eyes widening. "Where did you—" "Washed up on the rocks," he said softly. They looked at each other, then at the compass. The needle trembled once, as if acknowledging the reunion, then stilled completely. Claire folded the scarf, smoothing each frayed edge with her palm. "Do you think it's over?" she asked. Michael looked toward the window where mist drifted across the lake. "Maybe for her," he said. "Maybe not for the ground." That night, as dusk sank behind the tree line, the family sat by the fire in silence. The wind was soft, almost kind. Leah sketched the horizon, just outlines, nothing ominous. When she finished, she handed the drawing to her mother. It showed the lake, the cabin, and a small figure standing near the trees. Claire frowned. "Who's that?" Leah smiled faintly. "Someone who finally found north." Claire didn't ask more. She just nodded, folded the page, and tucked it into the Bible where Jonas's old letter had once been. At dawn, fog rolled over the lake, low and silvery. Inside the cabin, the compass sat motionless on the shelf. Its glass clear. Its needle finally still. For the first time in months, no one dreamed of snow or tunnels or knocking from beneath the ground. In the town below, the sealed mine remained undisturbed, officially closed, quietly forgotten. But sometimes when the wind came down from the ridge, it carried a faint metallic sound, like something turning, once then stopping for good. The compass needle shifted once, then stopped forever.